In the Sherlock Holmes story, The Blue Carbuncle, Holmes is presented with a goose and a hat left behind by an elderly gentleman when he was attacked. Holmes makes deductions from the hat in considerable detail. He dates it as 3 years old and suggests that the owner would have bought a replacement had he not fallen on hard times. Hats are clearly items in constant use in need of regular replacement. Holmes also remarks that the hat is fitted with a hat protector, another mark of its value. Holmes decides to advertise the finding of the hat in the evening papers. Neither he nor Watson see anything strange in this. They make the unquestioning assumption that a hat is so important that to advertise its finding is perfectly reasonable. He is sure to keep an eye on the papers, says Holmes, since the loss was a heavy one, and everyone who knows him will direct his attention to it. The hat is cracked, dusty, spotted with candle wax, and dabbed with ink to try and hide the worst marks, and yet its elderly and donnish owner is desperate to get it back. He turns up to recover it wearing a tam o' shanter, which is fitted neither to my years nor my gravity. Clearly, he feels that he has to have some head covering, however silly he may look, in order to be able to make the journey to Baker Street. In Edward Bellamy's futurist utopian tract, Looking Backward, the hero, having fallen asleep in the 1880s and woken in the year 2000, wants to go and have a look at this new world. There was a hat in the hall, and opening the front door, which was fastened with a slightness indicating that burglary was not among the perils of the modern Boston, I found myself on the street. We see that the absence of a hat for his head would have kept him inside as certainly as a locked front door. Finally, in Bleak House, we find Mr. Guppy, who is so desperate to ensure he won't be accused by Esther of breach of promise that when she leaves, in a minute he came after us down the street without any hat. Hats have always afforded opportunities for fashion statements and for social, commercial, and industrial classification. But what is frequently missing from examinations of the significance of hats is any recognition of the iron rule. Hats are not fashion accessories. They are essential items of wear without which people might as well be naked. First slide, please. In an illustration from Oliver Twist's Meeting with the Artful Dodger of 1871, Oliver is destitute, exhausted, and starving, yet he is wearing a cap. Next slide, please. Books of fashion and etiquette do not refer to the necessity of a head covering. It's an unspoken given. An alternative source of significant information is, as we see, popular art and literature, which necessarily embody, reflect, and display the rules of quotidian culture in all their minutiae. Illustrations, early photographs, and film convey the absolute of some form of headgear. In this paper, I'm limiting myself to the 19th and 20th centuries, except in my closing remarks. Next, please. Here's a street scene of Dublin in the late 19th century. Next, please. And a tea packing warehouse of the same period. Next, please. And here is William Gladstone taking an imaginary journey on a public omnibus. Everyone in the coach and everyone in the street is hatted. And women equally had to have headgear to go out. Next, please. Here, Nancy the prostitute meets Rose Maylie, the nice middle-class girl, in 1838. Both wear bonnets. Bonnets seem crucial. Next, please. In Elizabeth Gaskell's Ruth, she flew back to her room and, snatching up her bonnet, ran, tying the strings with her trembling hands as she went down the stairs out at the nearest door. Lucy in Pearson the Labourer performs the same maneuver. Snatching up her bonnet and shawl, Lucy sped away on her errand. The phrase becomes a cliche for female departure. At the sound, she leapt to her feet, snatching up her bonnet. He suddenly had her by the shoulders. Not quite yet. This is from Gone with the Wind, published in 1936. But the author, Margaret Mitchell, is not merely showing the depth of her historical research. Hat wearing was still essential in the first half of the 20th century. Next, please. Here is William Brown in a Just William episode from the late 20s, unexpectedly clean and neat in the company of smart adults. Next. And here he is the normal William with his gang in their headquarters in the old bar. And in both circumstances, everyone is hatted. Next. In Elmer Rice's comic novel in 1930, A Voyage to Purilia, a death is diagnosed and acknowledged on the planet of Purilia, not by medical procedures, but by bystanders removing their hats and placing them over their chests. The presence of the hats is axiomatic, as it is here, next please, in this extraordinary clocking off photograph from the early 1920s. And here, next please, is Broadway in the 1930s. Next please. The slogan which I've chosen as the title of this paper, "If you want to get ahead, get a hat," dates from 1948, but does not, however, indicate that hat wearing was by then as important as it had been. The slogan was coined for the launch of the Hatters Information Centre by the newly formed Hatters Development Council in an effort to reverse the decline of hat wearing, especially among young men who were declared not to be hat conscious. As millions of people were being demobbed in the years 1945 to 48, they were given not only a demob suit, but also a hat. To the establishment, the hat was still an essential requirement, but this was not the general trend. One might assume that in a culture which does not wear hats, their ubiquity in previous periods would make them prime objects for the costume designer to exploit. But the reverse seems true. Theatre, TV, and film continually limit the appearance or use of hats in period drama. But it's not merely changes in fashion and custom which has tended to the limitation of hats in performance. There are strong practical reasons. Hats are inimical, as every actor and costume designer knows, to the practice of theatre because they hide the face. They do so because the stage lights hang above the performers and hats therefore throw shadows over their faces. But more importantly, they do so because the seating rakes and tiers of a theatre auditorium lift a large proportion of the audience to a higher level than the performers, who have to look up for their faces to be seen. Hats can indeed be manipulated, and this becomes a practical necessity under these circumstances. Next slide, please. Laurence Olivier in The Entertainer may sport a grey bowler hat as part of his seedy comedian's costume, but he wears it tipped on his head, and during his act, he plays with it and his own shifty stage persona, dipping in and out of the shade of the brim. Additionally, as a front cloth comedian, he uses a low angle follow spot, lighting him from the front, not from above. Next, please. In theory, TV and film should pose no such restrictions to hat wearing. In reality, the appearance and use of hats in these media is erratic. There are, of course, shining exceptions. The Sherlock Holmes series of the 1980s were conspicuously hatted, as was the 1995 TV serialization of Pride and Prejudice. But even here, there are questions. In The Cardboard Box, a worried young man goes out without his hat, but he does not rush, and there is no hat in the hall for him to ignore. And Elizabeth Bennet is hatless, next slide please, in her confrontation with an ostentatiously hatted Lady Catherine de Bourgh in the Bennet's garden. Next slide, please. The only really scrupulously hatted costume piece I can find, although the New York scenes in the 2005 version of King Kong run them close, is the 1978 film version of the 39 Steps. But that is over 40 years old, and hat wearing was less unusual to directors and performers. Hannay is once seen striding hatless over the heather after a perilous escape from a train. But when, pursued by German agents, he gets the idea of disguising himself, the camera, and thus Hannay's gaze, pans across to where a hat hangs on a peg and zooms in. And Robert Powell, next slide please, certainly looks very dashing in his disguise. Perhaps this is the key. Next please. In a genre generated from the written and the spoken word, it is paradoxical that in TV, film, and costume drama, The image is everything. If our heroes and heroines are encumbered with items which to us seem incongruous or grotesque, it might denature and disempower them in their roles. Jacqueline Durran, who costumed the 2005 film of Pride and Prejudice, speaks of knowing the rules and breaking them selectively. Her designs involve a conspicuous lack of head coverings for Keira Knightley as Elizabeth Bennet. Next. Who ends up looking like Merle Oberon as Cathy in the 1939 film of Wuthering Heights. Next, please. Who in turn is embodying a 20th century visual trope for a free spirit. In the original book, Cathy wears a hat, even when climbing a tree, and when it falls off, she instantly climbs down after it. There is no mention of dark locks streaming in the wind. Next, please. In striking contrast to the prominence of hats in the costume designs of Joanna, I beg your pardon. In striking contrast to this is the prominence of hats in the costume designs of Joanna Eatwell for the TV series Wolf Hall, which is set in the reign of Henry VIII. We enter a world where hats are in constant play in ways which underscore for us the sheer difference between the customs and behavior of that world and our own. One of the most frequent gestures is the most telling. When men meet equals or superiors, they make a reverence, reaching round to the back of the head to peel off their hats with a forward motion, bringing a ghostly echo of the removal of a helmet and the inclination of the neck in submission. Joanna Eatwell has said, "The design ethos I favor wherever possible is original practice. It's not the easiest of routes, but it is immensely satisfying and endlessly challenging." But this very action of making a reverence, which I've just described, appears in a scene in Hamlet, which I find dangerously confusing. Towards the end of Hamlet, there is a famous scene in which Hamlet is propositioned by Osric, an attendant lord, to a duel with Laertes. Once the initial lines have been spoken, Hamlet says, "Put your bonnet to its right use, 'tis for the head." Clearly, Osric has made reverence when greeting the Prince Hamlet. Having done so, he would be expected to put his hat back on again. But Osric, in an irritating excess of civility, does not do so. He has to be reminded again and again, begs off from complying, presumably continuing uncovered for the rest of the scene. In most productions of Hamlet, whatever the interpretation, everyone is hatless, and Osric stands out like a sore thumb. Many directors clearly relish the comic interlude quality of the scene, encouraging much fawning and gurning. But this sidesteps the real issues in play here. Osric flourishing his hat is a meaningless image. Instead, his behavior should prompt a niggling question. Hamlet is the putative heir to the Danish throne, pretty much the boss. If Osric continues to resist his requests, how much power does Hamlet actually have at this point? He's already been semi-banished, has returned alone and destitute, and enjoys his reinstatement solely through the good offices of Claudius the king, who, the audience already knows, is arranging to have him killed. Perhaps this tableau of Osric, insistently hatless despite Hamlet's requests, is an unsettling picture of Hamlet's now increasingly marginal existence. I would contend that this scene begins to suggest, all through the use of a hat, a tiny but growing loss of agency on Hamlet's part. Certainly his friend Horatio thinks so. "You will lose this wager, my lord," he says, after Osric's departure. I would cut the hat lines completely. Hamlet's always cut to ribbons anyway. Their absence would not affect the dramatic narrative. Their presence is dangerously distracting to a 21st century hatless audience. Perhaps this is an example of original practice being trumped by selective rule breaking. Food for thought, I think. Thank you very much.